Amen. All right, we have been going through the Gospel of Matthew. If you remember from last week, we were in the Gospel of Matthew, and we were in chapter 5, all right? But we're rewinding to chapter 1, okay? We didn't cover the first couple chapters of Matthew when we started the Gospel of Matthew because we were saving it for Advent, saving these narratives of the birth of Jesus for this time of the year where we celebrate and remember the birth of Jesus. So we're rewinding back to chapter 1 of Matthew, and we begin the Gospel of Matthew, kind of in a strange way. At first it seems strange. Matthew begins with a long list of names. Okay, if you're writing a book and you really want people to go to page 2, usually we wouldn't think it's a great idea to put a long list of names on page 1. That's not really the way we would hook our audience. But actually, I'm assuming a couple of people in here maybe watch TV occasionally, right? Don't admit it. I mean, I know you normally are praying, but if you're not praying and studying the Scripture, maybe we turn on the TV every now and then. And then at the beginning of a TV show, you always have this like 30-second recap of the previous couple of episodes, right? We're familiar with this concept. There's a recap at the beginning, previously on Lost, we're still stuck on an island, or previously on Walking Dead, here's someone getting their face eaten by a zombie. Previously on Mad Men, everybody's drunk. I mean, it just fill in the blank. With whatever your TV show is, at the beginning, there's 30 seconds that kind of catches everybody else up on, here's where we are in the narrative. Here's where we are in the story. This is what's happened in a real brief nutshell. Here's what's happened up till now. And that kind of brings us in. It reminds us of all the story that's happened leading up to then. It sets the stage for the action that's about to happen. And that's what Matthew is doing here, believe it or not. He's reminding his readers that God's story has been going on a long time. And here is a quick few verses of genealogy, but it's genealogy that rings the bells for this primarily Jewish audience that Matthew is writing to. It's ringing the bells of the story of Israel. He's saying that Jesus comes to us. The Son of God becomes human and comes to this earth, and there's context to that. He comes to fulfill a story that's been going on since the beginning of time as we know it. And so he's setting the stage. This is what God's been doing. These are the people God's been working through. This is the context, and now that's setting the stage for what God is about to do, the new thing, the fresh thing God's about to do in Jesus. So we wouldn't normally think of a genealogy, as a way to hook an audience, but, and a lot of us skip through these long lists of names, and I don't blame you for, it's like, long list of names. Okay, next page. A lot of times that makes a lot of sense. But here, with the genealogy of Jesus, Matthew's putting this here for a really good reason. A lot of people, the Jews in this time period, were really fascinated by genealogies. And people are really fascinated by genealogy today, right? I mean, people spend a lot of time on genealogy.com and ancestry.com and who knows what else, searching out who our long lost relatives were. Were they psychotic? Were they famous? Were they good? Were they bad? What were they like? It's fascinating. And so we still kind of get that genealogies are interesting to people, always have been. And so these names that Matthew's listing aren't just a bunch of arbitrary names. These are key names from the history of Israel that set the context for here's what God's been doing. Here's where the story is up till now. And he says, chapter 1 of Matthew, verse 1, this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now, what Matthew is going to establish here is that Jesus is a son of Abraham. He's going to trace Jesus' family tree all the way from Abraham. He's saying that Jesus is the fulfillment. He is the heir to everything promised to Abraham. God told Abraham, I'm going to make a people out of you. Those people are going to be blessed. They're going to be a blessing to the nations. They're going to be a light to the nations. And Matthew's going to tell us here, he's hinting at it here, he's going to flesh it out throughout this gospel, that Jesus is truly a son of Abraham. He is a true Israelite. He is the one and only faithful member of the people of God. You know, God had worked and worked and worked with the patriarchs, and all the way through Genesis, if we remember our study of Genesis, we just see people fail one after another. And the history of Israel there's high points, but there's just kind of one failure after another. The people failed to be what God called them to be. Well, here comes Jesus, the true son of Abraham. He's the true Israelite. He's going to be what nobody else had ever been able to be, and that's 100% totally reliable, faithful. He is the faithful one. That's what it means for him to be a true son of Abraham. Did we eat a turkey biscuit this morning? Anybody eat some turkey this morning? Got some tryptophan kicking in? We good? All right. We can run a lap around get up and dance if you need. I think some churches we dance in the middle of the service just because we want to keep people awake. So I'm all for that. If we need to get up and dance around, that's cool. Do what you got to do. Jimmy, you can lead the dance if you want to. No? He's good? So anyway, just give him dance if you need to. Nobody's going to judge you. So he's the true son of Abraham. He's a true Israelite. And then he also says he's a son of David. Now, the people of God have been looking for this king like David that's gonna come about. There was a promise that God made to David long time ago in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that there was going to be a king who would sit on his throne, but his kingdom would be an eternal kingdom. His kingdom would be an everlasting kingdom. And one king after another would follow David, and none of them could ever fill David's shoes. And David's shoes were kind of warped to begin with. I mean, he was a great guy, but certainly not perfect. Lots of mistakes, but nobody could ever meet that high watermark of David. People tried and they failed over and over and over, and actually went from bad to worse to even worse. And so the people are saying, the Israelites are saying, where is this king? The king that's going to be like David, that's going to rule with justice, who's going to have a heart after God's own heart. And what Matthew is saying is there is this true king, and his name is Jesus. And he's going to fill the throne of David in a way that nobody even dreamed or imagined could be possible. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His kingdom is a worldwide, global kingdom. His kingdom has no end. And he's going to rule with total justice, faithfulness, truth. Matthew establishes from the beginning that Jesus is the son of David. He's the true king that we were looking for and didn't even know it. He's the true son of Abraham. He's the faithful Israelite. But he begins with saying, this is the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. That word translated genealogy is actually the Greek word that means Genesis. Literally what Matthew says is, this is the book of Genesis. This is the book of Genesis of Jesus Christ. And that's not a mistake that Matthew uses the word Genesis. Because remember, at the beginning of Genesis, we talked about creation, right? That's where Genesis begins. And so Matthew is sliding this word Genesis in here, and this phrase, the book of Genesis, is actually used, or the book of the generation of, is used several times in the book of Genesis. Whenever the author of Genesis wants to establish a new phase in what God is doing, or they're establishing a really important a new piece of the narrative, they say this is the generation of. And so Matthew's saying this is the book of the Genesis of, or the generation of. What he's saying is, Genesis, we think of creation. And in this phrase carries with it the connotation from the book of Genesis that, hey, something new, something really important is about to happen. And so what Matthew's getting at is, Jesus, the true Israelite, the true son of David, has come to bring about new creation. He's come to do something new. He's come to move the ball forward from where it's been. He purposefully uses this word that reminds us of creation because Jesus has come to bring about new creation. Now, we just celebrated a major holiday, right? We celebrated a major holiday where families get together and have time together, where we really stick together and find out what we're made of. The holiday I'm talking about, of course, is Black Friday. I don't know, was there another holiday somewhere? Black Friday. I noticed on the news that England had a Black Friday. Did you know this? England had a Black. They don't even have Thanksgiving, okay? But they don't have we celebrated Thanksgiving when we got away from those guys, all right? No offense to any English people here today. We celebrate Thanksgiving because we got away from them. Now, they don't have Thanksgiving the same day we do, but they've got Black Friday. And I watched, and all these English people, they're like, they're wrestling over TVs and Barbie dolls, and they're running in the store. And the newscaster said, England has celebrated their Black Friday this year because they wanted a taste of an American-style Black Friday. And I thought, wow, we are really a city on a hill. I mean, we got it going on. We've exported this to the world. But, as I think about Black Friday, I mean, really, I wish I could say that I don't do it because I'm not materialistic. But I mean, I'm as materialistic as the next guy. I see an ad, for Black Friday, 80-inch TV for $12, and I think, wow, I need a couple of those. We'll put one in the bathroom, and that'd be great. And it's just really, the reason I don't participate is just sheer laziness. I find out I got to be there at 4 in the afternoon to wait till midnight, I say, nah, it's okay. I'll just stick with what I got. There's no deep spiritual reason. It just comes down to laziness on my part. But what Black Friday tells us, and this phenomenon of it, some of you participated in it. I'm sure you were kind and gentle and demonstrated the fruit of the Spirit. That's great. But what it tells us, Black Friday is just kind of a symptom, but our entire culture of materialism tells us that we are a culture desperately trying to fill something, trying to fill some emptiness. Anybody that's going to drop kick somebody in the face over a Barbie doll is trying to fill a void in our lives. Again, this isn't condemn you if you went shopping. The point is, as I look at our culture that idolizes material things, I realize that we live in a society desperate to fill our emptiness, which takes me back to creation. What did God do when He created this world? He formed what was formless, and He filled what was empty. He filled what was empty. The oceans were empty, God put fish in them. The skies were empty, God put birds in them. The land was empty, God put animals on it. The sky was empty, and he put stars and a sun and a moon. God fills what's empty. He did that at the beginning. He still does that now. And as we prepare for Advent, as we prepare to welcome Jesus in His fullness in our lives, I'm reminded that when Jesus was born, Joseph took Mary, his very pregnant, very expectant wife, and they knocked on door after door after door, and they couldn't find, right? We know the story. They couldn't find a place for Jesus to be born because everybody was full already. There wasn't any room. And I guess what I'm getting at is, what are we filling ourselves with? Are we full of stuff? Are we filling our emptiness to the point that we don't have any space left for the Lord to come do in us what He wants to do? Are we full and satisfied today? Or are we empty and desperate? Because the new creation that Jesus is offering is good news for the empty. It's good news for the desperate. It's good news for the hungry. It's good news for those that are not full. God fills what is empty. We're constantly trying to fill our own emptiness. Some of us are doing that through stuff. Some of us are doing it through relationships. Some of us are doing it through work. Some of us are doing it through some kind of illicit behavior. And those are all attempts to fill our emptiness in our own way. Jesus has come to fill your emptiness as only He can, and mine. Are we empty and desperate to be filled, or are we full and satisfied? As Matthew lays out these names, he's going to give us 3 lists of 14 names. He says between Abraham and David, there were 14 generations. From David to the exile to Babylon, there were 14 generations. From the exile of Babylon until Christ, there's 14 generations. 3 times 14 Another way to work that out, 3 times 14 would be the same as 6 times 7. And 7 is a really important number for Hebrews. It means perfection. It's also the number of days in a week, and that's how many days were in the creation week. And so if he's describing 3 sets of 14, also known as 6 sets of 7, when we come to Jesus, Jesus begins the 7th set of 7. He begins the new creation week. Again, Matthew in some really subtle ways is saying Jesus has come to bring about new creation, to fill what's empty, to form what's formless, to bring light to what's dark. He's a son of Abraham, he's a son of David, and he's come to bring new creation. As we look through this list, the central period here is the period leading up to the people of Israel being deported to Babylon. He lists a bunch of names, and then down in verse 11, he says, Josiah, the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, he goes on and he continues. When the people of Israel, they had wandered away from God, they had wandered far from God, God sent prophets to warn them that things got to change, but things didn't change, things kept getting worse, and the people of God lost their lands, and they were defeated. Jerusalem was defeated and leveled by the Babylonians, and the people of Israel were taken captive to Babylon, and they spent 70 years there, and then they were allowed to come back to their land. But because the people of Israel lived under a dictatorship, a Roman dictatorship, they still considered themselves to be in exile. Even though we're in our land, we're not free, and they considered themselves to be in exile still. And so this word exile is really important in the story that has been written up until the point of Jesus coming on the scene. And Jesus has come to free his people from their exile, from their slavery. But it's not just exile from Babylon or slavery to Rome. He's come to what Matthew's going to flesh out for us. He's come to free us from our exile to sin and our slavery to sin. But as we read through this genealogy of Matthew, we see these really high points. We've got Abraham, man, he's an awesome guy. Then we've got David, and we've got this really low point of the exile to Babylon. The story of Israel, if we're still together, the story of Israel is a story of victory and loss. It's a story of failure and redemption. Who else's story does that sound like? Maybe yours? Maybe mine? High points and low points, failures and victories. That's the story that has been going on, that's been transpiring before Jesus steps on the scene. Your story and mine is a story of victory and a story of loss. And Jesus steps into your story. He enters Israel's story and rewrites it in a fresh and in an unexpected way. Jesus, in the season of Advent, Jesus wants to step into our stories with all their pain, with all their brokenness, with all their failures, with all their mess ups. He wants to enter into your victory, and he wants to enter into your loss and mine. And he wants to rewrite our story in a fresh and in an unexpected way. Well, I already gave my life to Jesus. Good. He still wants to enter your story in a deeper way and rewrite your pain, your loss in a new and a fresh way. Does that sound good to anybody? Man, some of our stories, I'm not quite there yet. Some of our stories need to be, I jumped the gun. It was wishful thinking. I'm not there yet. I'm sorry, Brenda. I'm sorry. It's Christmas, but it's not Christmas yet. I'm not that generous. No, but I stepped down there. That was the signal, but I just got excited. All right, and for that I repent. So there's some unlikely people in this story too. As we read this first section, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. And Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Ram, and Ram the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon. And Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. And David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah. As we go through that first part of the list, there's 4 names that are very, very, very unusual to be there. 4 names that are really unexpected. And those are the names of 4 women. 4 women. Now, generally, in a genealogy, a Jewish genealogy, no women's names would be given because they're talking about the father's line. But 4 women are mentioned. Bathsheba's not mentioned by name. She's called the wife of Uriah, but he's talking about Bathsheba. The 4 women that are mentioned, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. The other thing, the first thing that makes these unlikely to be in the genealogy of Jesus is they're women. The second thing that makes them unlikely to be in the genealogy of Jesus is they're not Jewish. They're Gentiles. They're non-Jews. And the third thing that makes them unlikely to be in this list is they all did some sexually questionable stuff. Now I got your attention. Hello, could I heard a pin drop? There's some questionable behavior from these women. Tamar, if you remember from Genesis 37 and 38, who could forget that sermon where we talked about Tamar and what she did was, her father-in-law Judah was after Tamar's 2 husbands died. Judah made a promise to give her to his 3rd son because that was what was appropriate and right in those times, and he didn't do it. And she was disgraced and she was abandoned, and her hope of conceiving a child was dashed. But there was some compulsion to further her line. And where's that compulsion coming from? Well, there's the sense of self-preservation, and in those times, every woman needed to have a child. You needed somebody to take care of you. You wanted to continue your line. But what if part of the compulsion for her to have a child was she doesn't realize it, but she's in the lineage of Jesus Christ. This child has to be born. And so what she did was she dressed up like a prostitute and she hung out by the side of the road, and her father-in-law came walking down the road with his cane, and he sees her and he propositions her. They have sexual relations, and they go their separate ways. She asks him for his staff and his seal as payment, and the story ends there. Well, turns out later, Judah finds out that his daughter-in-law is pregnant and she's not married. And Judah's first response, anybody remember what his first response was? To kill her. Bring her out and let her be burned was his response. This man who's just had intercourse with a prostitute, he thinks, he turns around and harshly judges someone else for their failure and their sin. He says, bring her out and to be burned. And so she sends she returns his cane back to him and his belongings back to him. And she says, the father of the child is the owner of these. And he looks at him and he says, uh-oh. And he says, Tamar is more righteous than I am. And so those children born in very, what we would call unique circumstances, they're here in this bloodline. This is a morally questionable situation, to say the very, very least. And then we've got Rahab further down, who was a prostitute, lived in the city of Jericho, who let Israelite spies climb up in her window, and she sold out her own people, and she escaped judgment. And Jericho fell because she helped the spies, and God saved her life. And God put her in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And then we got Ruth. I'm not going to say too much bad about Ruth, but there was this thing where, she's a great woman, but she's not an Israelite. And she went and she laid at her husband-to-be's feet in the middle of the night to, see if he wanted to be married. I don't think they were having a Bible study when she laid at his feet. This is what we'd call morally questionable, all right? Morally questionable behavior. And yet here she is, an Israelite, a woman, morally questionable in the lineage of Jesus Christ. And God put her there. And then we've got Bathsheba. David sees her bathing. She's married. David and she have relations together. She becomes pregnant. David kills her husband. None of these morally questionable situations are God's best or what God would want to have happen. I'm not saying go out and do these things. But what I am saying is there's some real surprises in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. The first section is dominated by sex. You got Rahab, you got Ruth, you got Tamar, you got Bathsheba, and then the next section, starting with David, is characterized as dominated by violence. One violent king after another. David himself said of himself that he's a man of bloodshed, and then every king after him is worse than him. And there's some really bad characters in there. So the first section of names is characterized by illicit sex. The second paragraph from David to Babylon is characterized by incredible violence. And then the third paragraph from the exile to Babylon to the time of Christ is characterized by an empty people longing to be filled. And it's in that world of violence and sex and loss and sin that Jesus steps in. That's our world. That's our world that Jesus steps into. We just got back from Thanksgiving. Some of you were rubbing elbows with some morally questionable family members. Some of them are saying the same thing about you and about us today. When we're around our family, it can be tough. It can be funny, and it can be really deeply sad and disturbing and disheartening. And when Hebrews says that Jesus identifies with our weakness because he became just like us, he became just like us to the degree that even Jesus was born in a crazy family. Even Jesus was born to a sinful family. Even Jesus was born in a family with lots of brokenness in it. And yet God took that broken down, messed up, sinful, violent, depraved family, and he said, I'm putting you people in the lineage of Jesus Christ. Does that not just kind of floor us a little bit? This list of people isn't a list of the best people who've ever lived. It's a real checkered list of people. So what we get out of that is that Jesus' birth, as we look at Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, Jesus' birth is good news for outsiders. Good news for those on the fringes. Good news for those in need of a new beginning. All four of those women that we mentioned earlier, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, they were all desperately in need for a fresh start, for a new beginning, for somebody to step in and help rewrite their story. That resonates maybe with somebody here this morning. Maybe somebody here this morning is saying, I'm in need of a fresh start. I'm in need of a fresh beginning. I'm in need of somebody to step in. I'm in need of Jesus Christ himself to step into my life and rewrite my story. It's in our world of illicit sex, violence, loss, and emptiness that Jesus Christ steps in. And as I wrap up, I want to read from a sermon by a man named Herbert McCabe. McCabe runs through all these lists of characters that we just did, and he says that they're anything but an admirable group of folks. The unscrupulous and entertaining Jacob. We didn't even talk about Jacob. He won his position in the line of Christ by lying and cheating his blind father. David, the ruthless and highly successful bandit, unites the tribes of Israel through intrigue and murder. Rehoboam, son of Solomon, loses most of David's gains through arrogance and greed. Ahaziah, the son of Ahab, continued his father's ways as a sadistic mass murderer. Matthew's genealogy, therefore, according to McCabe, is a stark indication that God's plan is not always accomplished through pious people. Can anybody breathe a sigh of relief? God's plan isn't I mean, it's good to be pious. And I hope we're all growing that direction. But God's plan is not always accomplished through pious people. It's certainly not accomplished through perfect people. But through passionate and thoroughly disreputable people. The moral is almost too obvious to belabor. Jesus did not belong to the nice, clean world of middle-class respectability, but rather He belonged to a family of murderers, cheats, cowards, adulterers, and liars. He belonged to us and came to help us. No wonder He came to a bad end. And He gave us some hope. So, this season, as we celebrate Emmanuel, God with us, we're reminded that God is for those who have no reason to have God for them. God is for those who have no claim on God. God's for us. God is for those who know that they need God and that we're desperately empty without Him and that we need Him to fill our emptiness. God is for those that are not doing Him a favor by being on His team, that are not doing the world a favor by following Jesus. But God is for those who realizes that God has done us an ultimate favor by letting us be part of what He's doing. God is with us, the unexpected, the undeserved. What Simon and Garfunkel referred to as the sat upon, the spat upon, and the ratted on. God is for you. And if we're pious this morning, God's for you too. God wants us to grow in holiness. He wants us to grow in grace. He wants us to grow in maturity. But God uses people all across the board. People that are broke down and empty and people that kind of have it together. The key is for us to realize that none of us really have it together. All of us are in need of Him to come and fill emptiness in our lives. So I ask you to think about what emptiness do you have in your life? How are you trying to fill it? Just sit with that question for a minute. I'm sitting with it for myself. What is our emptiness? How have we been trying to fill it on our own? What would it look like for Jesus to step into your story in a fresh way? Fill your emptiness. What would it look like for Jesus to step into your story and somehow rewrite it in a fresh and unexpected way? As you think about your story of loss and victory, brokenness and pain, good and bad and ugly, just like the people of Israel had come to a certain point, and then Jesus stepped in. You got all your life behind you. And everything you've done, everything that's been done to you, all the good, all the bad, all the pain, all the victory, all the loss, it's brought you to this point, this moment, where you are now. And Jesus is knocking. Maybe you've been a Christian for 100 years. Jesus is still knocking. He says, I want to fill your emptiness. I want to rewrite your story. Maybe He's never entered your heart. Maybe you don't know Him yet. And maybe today is the day that can happen. That little baby that was born, that little baby that forsook his rights, was born in Bethlehem and died on a cross 33 years later. His blood stands between you and God. Purifies you. Gives you a chance to accept a free gift of eternal life that starts now and lasts forever. if Jesus comes and knocks on your heart today, are we full already? Are we full enough? Or are we just empty enough that we can invite Him in? If there's a decision on your heart, listen, if there's a decision on your heart, maybe it's to give your life to Jesus for the first time. Come down here, let's pray about it. Let's make that step. If your decision is you want to, like John did today, you want to follow Him in baptism, time for you to make it public that you belong to Jesus. Come down here. If you say, you know what, this group of misfits and vagabonds and this group of people is the people I want to do my life with, come down here and make it official. We'll welcome you. We'll embrace you. If you need prayer, you can pray at the altar. I'm also going to ask Brother Richard to come up, if you will. Brother Jimmy, would you also come up over here? Will, would you come over here? Lynn, go ahead and come up too, if you will. If you want to pray, you can pray with one of these folks. You can pray with me. You can pray at the altar and we'll just agree with you. Let's stand together as we surrender all. We make room. We surrender all.